welcome to the first panel. Now let's welcome Andy Mock. David Blair. And we have Tingjian from the CIIS Foundation and China International Problem Research Institute and Europe Institute Hongjian and Cui Yongfu, as well as the online speakers and from the Bruegel, Grégory, Claeys. We have Italy. Hello, Magri from the Politics Research Institute. And English Royal International Affairs Researching Senior Fellow Tim Summers. And CCG Senior Fellow. And Peking University International Strategy Researching Committee Jia Daozhong. Now let's welcome the moderator and the panel.
Andy Mock. I am delighted and honored to be here today. I am a senior research fellow with the Center for China Globalization. I'm also a commentator on China Global Television Network, where I cover technology, innovation, and the impact of technology on great power relations. And today we're going to, I think, have a very insightful panel and going to try to keep it as practical as possible. What I'd like to do is cover three broad questions. So this is, of course, a conference about think tanks. So first, I'd like to ask our panelists to share their views on COVID-19, but in particular, what impact, both positive and negative, that COVID-19 has had on their think tanks, as well as what they've observed about the think tank industry, if we could call it that in general. Then the second question I'd like us to explore is, how do our panelists see the incoming Biden administration? And again, from the perspective of a think tank executive and a participant in the think tank industry. And then finally, to make this as practical as possible for think tank practitioners, given that we are in this very disruptive time with COVID, with a new US political administration, with other very profound changes, what is one piece of advice or one observation that our panelists would like to share with our community of think tank participants? And before I start, I'm going to go in alphabetical order to call on our speakers, both here at the Penn Wharton China Center and online. So I'll just follow the list in alphabetical order. But to start us off, I just want to observe that COVID-19 has not just been a public health disaster through the direct health effects, but it's also had a less visible impact on the ability of other people with illnesses, other types of health problems to access the health system. It, of course, is an economic crisis as well. But I think also it's revealed deep inequalities within countries and across countries. And perhaps one of the greatest inequalities is the inequality in access or to enjoy the fruits of sound governance. So I think this is a very complex topic. How has COVID-19 affected the operation of your think tank, the industry in general? So let me maybe start then with David Blair, please. And please stick to about 5 minutes or so, so we do have time to cover everything.
Hello, everyone.
David Blair. Oh, David Blair is our CCG Vice President and Senior Economist.
Hello, everyone. I'm relatively new. I've been at CCG for about 2 months, and it's my honor to be working on the major mission, which is of CCG, which is establishing good relations between China and the United States and Europe and with the rest of the world. I want to talk a bit about what think tanks can do about international relations. it's important, especially in this time. COVID's made it worse, but relations were pretty bad before COVID. Relations with the US have been pretty bad back to maybe 2010 or 2012. Not sure when the turning point was. But right now, communications between think tanks is just about all there is. There's not much left. It's quite difficult for universities to communicate with each other, although there's some of that. The press is completely negative about China, at least in the United States. I'm not sure about in European countries. I had a conversation with a reporter a week or so ago from one of the major American news outlets, and I was suggesting a positive story about Chinese e-commerce that he could write. And he told me, I'm not allowed to write non-critical stories about China. So it's very difficult to change the public opinion in the United States about China. And I think think tanks are basically the only way to do it now. We had a conversation earlier this morning with some people from prominent Washington think tanks. They were largely negative about the relationship, although I was surprised that the people from Heritage and Cato were the most positive about the relationship. But I think we're in a very dangerous time right now. We will be for the next 10 years because the American policy establishment has not yet accepted the idea that China is going to be a peer and that China is going to be able to, they think that their belief is the belief in American primacy, that Americans should be the leader. Maybe they mean that in a good way, but they definitely believe America should be the leader. And they see China as a challenger. I lived in Washington for more than 20 years, so I'm naturally cynical and pessimistic. But actually, President-elect Biden's appointments give me some hope. The recent appointments, the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, because they are not people from the Clinton State Department. They were largely opposed to China, who supported the pivot to Asia. They are not those people. So I think we're seeing a possible move that could lead to better relations over time. That's a glimmer of hope that I'm seeing. Let me talk a little bit about think tanks. My first job, it was actually while I was still in graduate school. I started working for a think tank called Pan-Heuristics, which none of you have ever heard of. It's been defunct for 30 years. But it was very influential in my life. There were two major heads of the corporation. They were both very influential within the Reagan administration. And so they gave me a chance to see how the real world works coming out of college. And I want to tie this to the idea of talent. Participating in a think tank for young people can be an important step in their career. It can lead them to understand the real world much more than writing little academic papers. What passes your PhD committee is not what is useful in a think tank. So I want to suggest to all the think tank people listening that we think about what kinds of career paths do we need to offer to young people to sustain the think tanks throughout time. I'm running out of time very quickly here. So again, I want to reiterate that personal relations established through think tanks, personal relations, communications, and tone matter. It's very hard to demonize someone when you've just had a webinar with them the day before. So I think it's very important that we keep doing this kind of thing, that we have chats between people on a variety of topics, because it's really important to establish those kind of personal relationships. And one policy recommendation, this is off the wall, but I really think the US and China need to be working on confidence building measures, especially in the South China Sea. We need to find ways we can communicate and be sure some kind of crap doesn't get out of control down there and lead to destroying the world. So my 5 minutes is up. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Great perspective since you've spent time in DC and now in Beijing to give us I think, a very complete view of these questions. Now let me ask Tingjian, who's the program manager for Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung's Beijing office.
Thank you, Chair. On behalf of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, I'm very glad to be here to share my views about how a cross-national think tank like Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung with our European background can contribute in this changing international background. And first of all, I want to give a very short introduction about the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. We are a political foundation that is active in 14 forums for civic education and has 5 regional offices throughout Germany. We have around 100 offices abroad, which oversee projects in more than 120 countries. Our foundation was founded in 1964 and adopted the name of Konrad-Adenauer, who was the first German federal chancellor. And the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung is a think tank with a party affiliation. We are closely affiliated with the CDU party, the party of Konrad-Adenauer, and also the party of the current German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. Actually, we as a political foundation and also as a think tank is different from basically all think tanks worldwide due to our presence in more than 100 countries. It is quite difficult to describe our profile since we definitely have a think tank component in our work. But due to our close political ties, we have a think tank function like for the governing party in Germany, for the CDU party, and also for the general public. And actually, we are also ranked as one of the best think tanks. The Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung in China focus on promoting policy exchange and on developing and expanding channels and formats of political dialogue. German and European experts from the realm of politics, business, and academia are brought together with Chinese party and government representatives at conferences and roundtable discussions to share ideas about current national, regional, and global issues. We also organize study programs for experts, offer scholarships for students, as well as arrange platforms for young politicians and future leaders in policy contingency to foster exchange. Besides that, we also organize activities in China about the ecological, financial, and technical aspects of climate action and environmental protection, urbanization, digitalization, as well as the role of China in the changing international system. And then to my second point, what we can contribute to the what we as a think tank can contribute to the in this change in international background. I think in the context of the COVID-19 crisis and also the new US administration and many other issues which might have influence on the future international cooperation among countries as well as among institutions. There are definitely things that we as a cross-border think tank can do for a more constructive role. We can promote public awareness on issues such as the COVID pandemic, climate change, and globalization, etc., and promote consensus on solutions. We can organize conferences and other forms of discussion among Chinese and foreign experts on relevant issues and produce and timely publish analytical reports. We can also promote communication and dialogue between official agencies and social organizations and promote the need for social interests to be better integrated into the policymaking process. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And I think we'll come back to you for maybe some specific examples later. But let me move on now to Grégory Claeys, who's a senior fellow at Bruegel, and he's online. Grégory, please.
Hello, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I should say, in China. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to participate to this conference, even if I cannot be in Beijing. Thanks, Andy, for chairing this meeting. So just a word about Bruegel. Bruegel is a relatively young 15-year-old think tank based in Brussels and specializing into economic policy. But I want to use those 5 minutes that you gave me to discuss quickly what I think a think tank should try to do to foster global cooperation after Trump presidency. For those of us who believe that global cooperation is crucial to solve today's most pressing issues, Trump presidency has been quite difficult, to say the least. As it has been characterized by, let's say, aggressive unilateralism, a disregard for the very idea of public goods, some aversion for multilateral cooperation. It's a welcome change with the new US administration. And as David was saying, the first appointments in the State Department, for instance, shows that the Biden administration will not follow Trump's strategy and will try to normalize its external policy. However, as think tank, we should not expect a return to the pre-Trump status quo. The main issues of today and of the near future, the fight against the current pandemic, the fight against climate change, issues of migration, issues of financial stability, etc. They all require global cooperation. But to use an expression coined by my US colleague Adam Posen from Peterson Institute, about the post-Trump policy, I think tank will need to think on how to rebuild rather than how to repair the global order. What do we mean by that? I mean that we need to rethink our toolkit for collective action. Because the previous universal treaty-based institution from the 20th century, like the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, etc., they have served us very well in the past, but they have been criticized in the last few decades, and they need to reinvent themselves. They are not in charge to monitor the new interlinkages between countries that are the most relevant today, like environmental externalities, data flows, migration, global value chain, etc. And basically, as think tankers, we need to help design other kind of mechanism, maybe softer mechanism that do not involve hard rules or delegation of decision-making power to cooperate at the international level. For instance, as someone who has been working on monetary policy and central banking for years, I think, for instance, the cooperation between central bank could be a template for future cooperation. We could have cooperation between independent national agencies that have similar mandates. That could be a fruitful avenue for global cooperation. So it's just an example, and I don't have yet the solution, but it shows that think tank will need to work very hard to help solve the current problem and to foster cooperation globally. And I think, as David said, having a network of think tank at the global level and having meetings like the one we have today is really crucial to build a community that is able to build some consensus on some issues, or at least on how to frame those issues. It will be very important if we want to solve a global problem to have a global forum where we can discuss these issues. So that I'm going to stop here because I think I have used my 5 minutes, but I think I want to thank you for building such a forum where we can discuss these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Grégory. And I think your suggestion or observation using central banks as perhaps a model to learn from, I think is an intriguing one, and we'll come back to that. So now let's have Hongjian, who's a senior research fellow and the director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies, please.
Thank you, Chair, and also thank you for this opportunity to be part of the discussion. Anyway, I agree with some points from the other panelists, especially about the role of the think tank. I think especially if we look at this influence or impact of the COVID-19, I think we are more clear that what we should do as a think tank. For example, just like David mentioned, we should promote this communication, even in a very different way than before. Another, I think we should try to uphold is so-called independent role for think tank, especially to find out more, useful or effective viewpoints. Also, we know the recent years, the very, very clear characteristics of the international relation is more politics. So how could we as think tank keep an independent role to contribute our viewpoints? I think it's very important. And now another issue is how could we try to insist this scientific attitude. As we know that in recent years, there is a concept to describe the situation in some country, so-called the post-truth. So I'm afraid that once we could not uphold this independent role to contribute to the policy making or some other, perhaps there will be a bad situation for think tank for this post-research or post-viewpoint situation. That will be bad for not only think tank itself and also for the environment of policy making. And I would like to try extend our discussion to the other topic raised by our chair, is how about this impact of COVID-19. Generally, we can find some maybe keywords to describe this impact. Most of them will start by D. As we know in English, the D mostly means negative. Firstly, how about this distance? Okay, the social distance, at least 1 meter. So the distance will give some problem or challenge to our communication, right? Because once we always keep distance, which means that there will be more space for disinformation, okay, for distrust. So I think that's also what we need to do. How could we try to find out a new formula or new model to keep our effective communication with, as we know, restriction of social distancing, okay? Another, I think, impact is how about this change of the logic for people, for this society. Maybe in future, there will be a new normal. For example, the mask will be part of the dress for people. And also, how could we find out a solution to go back to a rebalance? If we look at this current situation, the problem is how about the imbalance, okay? Now I would like to try to find out the issue of the international society, community, how to deal with the issue of vaccine, okay? Could we find out more cooperation, I mean, between those big countries or those capable players? And how could we get some more joint research? And then how could we try to provide vaccine to the international community as a public good. Because this pandemic or this COVID-19, expose a very, very big problem for this global governance, the blockage or the shortage of this, the current global governance. So I think that, but of course, now it's also the opportunity there. Once we can learn some lessons from this pandemic, the imbalance, the more distance, and we can try to find maybe a new or high level rebalance for more effective communication. And how could we try to contribute more to the global governance with more public goods? And finally, I think that recently, maybe today or tomorrow, we can find out more and more positive messages or news from most of the countries of the world. For example, Mr. Biden's back. What does it mean? Maybe now for American politics, or even for Mr. Biden himself, we can understand how difficult for him will go back to a normal situation for American politics. But I think that China, Europe, and some other countries, we should try to give some more positive message to Washington, some more encouragement to Biden and his team that the multilateralism always useful and beneficial, approach, not only to achieve the American interests and also a kind of enlarged interests, a common interests for social, for international community. So I think I should stop here, and I'm like to jump into the discussion later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Hongjian. And I do appreciate that you started your remarks by focusing on COVID-19 and its impact on think tanks. So we all know that COVID-19 really has brought, at the very least, deep inconvenience, if not outright tragedy, to many people around the world. But for think tanks, there has been a silver lining. And one of them is the use of video conferences. So let me just share with you all just briefly here today. At our conference, we've had 2.2 million people watch or listen in. And now it's rush hour here in Beijing. And despite the famous Beijing rush hour, we have 700,000 people watching right now. So we do see that there are both disadvantages as well as advantages to COVID-19. And one of them, of course, is the ability to bring people together all around the world to discuss important topics, but also to have people everywhere join in, whether they're at home, at work, or perhaps even in their car. All right, so let me now move to Huang Ping, who is senior researcher at the Institute of Contemporary China and the World, as well as the former director of the Research Center for Europe at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and he is joining us online. Huang Ping. Unmute, please, Huang Ping.
Hello, can you hear?
Yes, we can hear you
yes,
now.
All right, all right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning. I'm happy to be here, and I saw many friends. Hongjian, one of them, also Huiyao, and others. I'd like to start with this current challenge of this pandemic. But actually, we had the difficulties. Some panelists have already mentioned, in particular, but not only between US and China. Since the financial crisis, 2008. But in recent years, it becomes more obvious in trade, in terms of how to see globalization or deglobalization. either with a sort of protectionist, even trade war, or to seriously deal with so-called imbalanced trade. But not only in trade, deglobalization, decoupling, all of those, again, it's more serious between US and China, but not only between US and China. So, but since the pandemic or the virus, which now is still so serious all over the world, maybe China and some parts in Asia, this part is in a much better, easier manner, at least. But my understanding or observation, preliminary, would rather perhaps all of us have underestimated the seriousness and its impacts, consequences of this pandemic, plus economic difficulties we already have, financial problems, climate change, some have mentioned, which can be even much longer and more serious. So all of this, putting them together, it could, to a certain extent, understandable that people by nature would at least first prefer kind of self-protection. Therefore, the mood would be rather a kind of isolation, deglobalization, decoupling, etc., etc. So the role of think tanks, I would argue first, in such serious challenges to all of us, if others by nature would first prefer kind of self-protection, therefore isolation from others, it is the think tanks which can still remain kind of connections, communications, interactions, and even coordination corporations. That kind of channels are so crucial for mutual understanding, if not a consensus yet, at least for communication, not disinformation, but for necessary key information sharing. These are the functions for all types of think tanks, bigger, smaller, older, and new. Second, with some hopes, I still hope, or in the long run, we definitely will, by cooperation again, overcome the very hard time this year, or even before this year, might be even more difficult next year. We will see. Again, not only, but partly, greatly because of the pandemic, but not only because of this. The first thing I think we need to understand, precisely because of those common challenges, difficulties, uncertainties, and even crises, human beings, wherever we are, whichever country we are members of, communication, cooperation, coordinations are the solutions, rather than isolation or whoever first kind of approach. Second, if in a sort of normal, let's say normal time, people can more or less manage themselves without so much coordination with others, either neighbors in the community or countries nearby, or globally speaking, regionally, globally speaking. But precisely during the crisis, natural, social, or whatever kinds, pandemic, disease, virus, then we need to, it is how and why there has to be a society rather than isolated individuals. And fourthly, we all have noticed Biden-elect today has nominated his team. And so even between US, China, or in US itself, US has also lots of difficulties in dealing with pandemic, in dealing with economy, in dealing with ethnic conflicts or problems between groups, etc., etc. So the new administration coming and the new team, not only in foreign policies, will more or less be working in a kind of willingness with others. So finally, I would argue, in spite of all the difficulties this year or even before, at least think tanks maintain kind of very basic and meaningful communications. And even with such difficulties between US and others, between US and China and others, either in Europe, in Asia, also we managed. The most recent case is just last week. There's a kind of REPT signed by, which became the largest and biggest sort of trade partner group. So these are the positive sides. I think my time of 5 minutes time is already over. Later, I'd like to join you for discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Huang Ping. Now let's move on to Paolo Magri, who is Executive Vice President and Chair of T20 Italy. Mr. Magri, please.
Thank you, Andy, and thanks for the invitation. One word on my institute. ISPI is an 86-year-old Italian think tank focused on international relations and politics. Your question is, what is the impact of COVID on think tanks' operation and growth? I will answer mentioning 3 less and 3 more that are put on our shoulders by the pandemic. The 3 less are quite painful. The 3 more are quite interesting but difficult. And then I will close with an overall comment. Let's start with the 3 less. Think tanks are forced to operate with less manpower. Take my institute. We have now been working remotely for 9 months, with a little exception in July, but July is not the rush time for our operation. And working remotely is fine, but coordination is much more complicated, much more difficult. The second less is less financial resources. It's hard to get sponsor and to get money, because they have and they will have less money as well, and they are not that much into our virtual operation and activities. And the third less is less attention, less political, media, and general public attention. We are all concentrated on our domestic fatigue and problems. How can we talk and elaborate, attract attention on what's going on in India or Syria or Libya or all the other difficult spots that the world offers us? And then 3 more, which something more we have to do. First, we already mentioned more digital, which is not bad, to be honest. Not only for what Andy mentioned, having 700,000 people following this conversation, but also for us. Take today. Of course, I'm not happy to be with you only from a virtual, in a virtual way. But let me be honest, if this were not the case, I could not at all be with you today, because tomorrow our main flagship conference, Rome Med, starts. In normal time, I would have declined the invitation. I could not travel to China for this conference. In this time, even remotely, which is not the perfect way, I am with you and I'm taking advantage, and I'm inspired by your comments and the comments of many colleagues which are speaking. Second, more interdisciplinary. Till a few years ago, interdisciplinarity for a think tank like mine would mean being able to merge, connect economic research and political research. Now this is over. We have to combine technological issues, health issue, inequality, energy, and many others. The third more is more coordination, more interconnection with other think tanks. In spite of being remote, in spite of being virtual, or thanks for the virtual format, I've been in touch, as many of you I'm sure, with my colleagues from all over the world so often this year, in the last few months, something which had never happened in the past. With some of you, with some other colleagues, I have weekly or monthly meeting, and this is great, this is an incredible opportunity. What is the overall balance, because I only have 20 seconds out of my 5 minutes. Let me end with these words. If it were not sometimes dramatic for people, dramatic for our economy, and dramatic for our institution, I would say this is an extremely stimulating and exciting moment overall. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very incisive discussion of that topic, Paolo. And whether you did it deliberately or not, that was a very Chinese formulation of 3 yeses and 3 mores. So very apropos for given where the physical part of this event is taking place. Let's now move on to Tim Summers, who is Senior Consulting Fellow of the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House, and he also is joining us online. Tim.
Thanks very much, Andy. And I'm just to be clear, I'm joining you from Hong Kong as well, rather than from Chatham House in London. So greetings from the south of China today. I want to start by saying I think what we're facing is a very political and very politicized world at the moment. We've already heard from David Blair about the politicization of discussions of China and US-China relations, and I think that has intensified over recent years. Looking around the world, I see societies where polarization has increased, where disagreements have grown, where governments are facing pressure or lack of clarity about the future, economic threats, a simple lack of money, obviously big challenges in health systems in many countries around the world. There seem to be contradictions in almost all policy areas. I think it's difficult for any government at the moment to work out what a good way forward is to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. There are no obvious or easy solutions. And if government policy making is about trade-offs, then the trade-offs that governments are being asked to evaluate just at the moment are some of the most difficult and most challenging that I think many have faced for a very long time. The sorts of ideologies of the past, free trade or liberalization that have kept policy debates going no longer really seem to offer any particularly fruitful or constructive solution. So we're definitely searching for new approaches. And I also like the quote from one of the earlier speakers about needing to rebuild rather than repair the global order. The question, the problem is who and how do you rebuild a global order? And COVID-19 and this year of crisis has struck us in the context of some already fairly intense discussions about where power lies in the global system, where it should lie, and how that distribution of power is changing. We've had debates about which institutions should be prioritized, which are effective, which are not, and which new institutions should be created or supported. And I have to say, in that context, actually, the signing of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership mentioned by HUANG, it seems to me quite a signal achievement in the context of everything that's going on, based on some long-standing talks and I think a flexible approach from some of the key countries. But perhaps that does indicate that there is some prospect of moving forward. So, of course, all of this and COVID-19 has come in the midst of a period of major global shifts. And a lot of this is structural. The rise in China's capability, especially in economic areas, is the most obvious example of that. I think in the West, there's growing insecurity about what the future holds and about the Western countries' position in that global future. I'm not personally one who believes that decline of the West and the US is inevitable, but there's clearly a shift in the relative distribution of power. And with those shifts in power come different approaches to governance and to values. Sometimes those differences are overplayed, I think, in the current context. I hear people talking about values wars and so on. I think that's really rather overstating what's going on. Nonetheless, you know, we're living in a pluralist world where we have different competing or contrasting models of governance in different parts of the world that we live in today. At the same time, we're all facing many of the same challenges, the same non-traditional security and non-state challenges. And COVID-19, I think, really has demonstrated that, you know, we do share some real common challenges as humanity on this planet. Climate change is, of course, another of those, and let's hope that under the Biden administration there is scope for a resumption of serious international and global cooperation to deal with that particular challenge. Nonetheless, though, it's a pluralist world. It's a world of many different countries and histories and systems that we are living in. And that trend is unlikely to be overturned, even though some would like to in the interests of some sort of universal model or universal values. So I think the question going forward is whether the major states and other actors in the global system can adapt to and adjust to this new reality. And that question is really a big question mark at the moment. Actually, I think it's far from certain that some of the major powers are able to adjust to what is going on in the world today. For think tanks, the temptation is to follow the political wind. I think all think tanks have more influence if they fit in with some political sentiment in the country or the society where they're based. But I think it's incumbent on us all doing research to give realistic analysis, to be objective, to be evidence-based, and to think about how the world is likely to be and how we should deal with it, not think about what sort of world we might prefer to live in if we had some sort of magic wand. Thank you, Andy.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. So now let's move back to our physical venue. Next we have Sun Yongfu, who is a senior fellow here at CCG. He's also the former Director General of the Department of European Affairs at MOFCOM. Please.
In Beijing.
Beijing.
Thank you very much, Andy. I realize this is the last session and the English-speaking session only. So actually, I joined the CCG after the retirement. That about 5 years ago. I worked for the government for, you know, for more than 30 years. As a government official, you have kind of a boundary all over, you understand. So I feel a kind of a freedom, you know, to speak in this audience as a senior research fellow of CCG. And the question is that what is the impact of COVID-19 to the think tank? I think the good thing is that, you know, we have much more of this kind of international forum or conference nowadays, and the influence is huge. as you mentioned, we have, 2.2 million audience right now listening to our debate. So for those closed door conferences, we don't have that kind of impact. I think this is a good thing, of course. And within 1 month, I participated quite a few, this kind of partially online seminars. And I just returned back day before yesterday from Guangzhou. There is a very important conference, and even President Xi sent a message, a letter to the conference, which is called Understanding China. There are a lot of former leaders of different states participated in that conference, and the conference itself was quite successful. A few days ago, I was attended another quite important forum, and in another think tank with the German think tank, which is called China Bridge. So quite interesting. And together with Professor Xu, we were in the State Councilor's office, and which we have a very intensive discussion about 2 days. A kind of discussion with different kind of European think tank from Brussels, from Poland, from the UK, from Germany, from from many different kinds of countries in Europe, discussing the relationship, especially Europe and China. It's very interesting because we have different ideas. Definitely, and we have interventions back and forth, quite in depth of a discussion. So I think the good thing is that, with this COVID-19, we can have this kind of conversation, which are more intensive, and with a lot of audience, they can have it online. And the bad thing, of course, is that face-to-face discussion is always very good, because the interaction of Q&A and you can have the feeling, and the attitude of those panelists. Immediately you can have that feeling. So, and the discussion itself could be more in depth, of course. And talking about the Biden administration, and I will definitely touch in great details, if time allows, in the Q&A session concerning the BIT between China and Europe, because both leaders are from China and from European leaders, and they concentrating on the target of finalize the BIT before the end of this year. And I believe that if Biden will be in the White House, most probably, and this is my hope, that we can rediscuss or reopen the BIT between China and the United States, because I believe that the investment treaty between China and Europe, and between China and the United States, is very important. This has a lot to do with the so-called decoupling, and trade itself is something not that important, I think, because we have a trade imbalance with our EU partners, with the United States. But we don't have that kind of a fight. So, for example, from the United States decoupling with the EU, because they have a kind of interaction between business in terms of the investment very intensively. So I think if we can finalize the BIT between China and the EU, and to restart our BIT with the United States, then naturally we can solve a lot of problems in between, or triangulate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yongfu. And clearly, with your experience at MOFCOM, we will definitely come back and explore more of these investments and the U.S. relationship as well. Let's move on now to Justine Weissy, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who's the Director General of the Paris Peace Forum, who is online. Justine?
Thank you, Andy, and thanks for the great panel. So the Paris Peace Forum is not exactly a think tank; it's partly a think tank. We are producing recommendations and analysis, but more importantly, we have an annual gathering in November where we gather heads of state and government, international organizations, but also companies, philanthropic foundations, NGOs, civil society, and others. And indeed, the Center for China and Globalization and Henry Huang has been part of a steering committee since the start 3 years ago. We just completed a very successful third edition where we had sort of the same remark that Paolo Magri was making earlier. We had more than 60 heads of state and government contributing either live by video or by pre-recorded video messages. President Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Trudeau or Conte and many others, along with civil society. And that's the important point. And that's probably what I can add to this discussion on the impact of COVID-19. You know, originally the Paris Peace Forum was designed to respond to the deterioration of multilateralism in the international system that was evident in the last 20 years. This deterioration turned into a breakdown in 2020 with the COVID-19 crisis. If you look at the main institutions, they didn't react very well. Actually, they didn't react at all for many of them. There were very few meetings of the UN Security Council. There was no G7. The G20 was not very active. I must say I was not very impressed by the results of this weekend for the G20. And countries tended to go the route of at least introversion, if not closing their borders, and the route of medical and vaccine nationalism rather than cooperation, which is a paradox because we all know that faced with COVID-19, the only route is cooperation, because we won't be safe until every country is safe, and we won't be prosperous until every country has gotten rid of the virus and is able to prosper and be a good trade partner for others and investment partners for others. So the paradox that was at the origin of the Paris Peace Forum, that we have more and more global challenges like climate, biodiversity, migration, etc. on the one hand, and that we have fewer and fewer resources or fewer and fewer, I would say, levers, is sort of magnified by COVID-19. That is not true, however, of lots of international cooperation that is not international in the sense of interstate, but rather of cooperation among actors. Whether it be cities, the C40, for example, or the Covenant of Mayors. The C40 is that network of cities around 40 cities that started acting for climate, or whether it's labs, even Chinese and American researchers publishing together, or labs cooperating, etc. There is cooperation. There is still a dose of goodwill and habits, a sort of a fabric, if you'd like, of that international system below the radar of great power politics. And that's what we're trying to build on. What we've done and what I think we should emphasize is not just multilateralism, but what Pascal Lamy, the president of the Paris Peace Forum, calls polylateralism. That is to say, just including to that discussion not just states, not just the traditional Westphalian game, if you'd like, but also these foundations, these companies and others. Let me take a very concrete example. Vaccines. What we did a week ago at the Paris Peace Forum is we gathered this initiative, this really important initiative called ACT-A, Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, which focuses on tests, therapeutics and vaccines, and more importantly, vaccines. And COVAX, which you might have heard about, which is the facility to distribute vaccine more widely, is part of that ACT-A initiative. And we put during a really interesting session, which you can watch in replay on YouTube on November 12th, President Macron, Melinda Gates, Dr. Tedros from the WHO, Prime Minister Erna Solberg from Denmark, and many others, the Wellcome Trust, the EU, of course, President von der Leyen from the EU, and many others. And what they did together is not just gather about $500 million more than what was on the table, but also put forward principles and plans to make the vaccine more widely available. And not just to a couple of, let's say, discrete countries that would be chosen because they need to be helped, but more generally, sort of rebuilding global governance from the bottom up and based on cooperation rather than based on the traditional institutions. The traditional institutions are precious and we should protect them and we should help them. But for me, rebuilding the global order must first be based on these global institutions, and second, on that idea that whether it's for climate, for health, for biodiversity, and there's the COP15 coming up soon in Kunming a few months from now, we need these other actors of the global society. Same with the economic consequences of the virus. During the Paris Peace Forum, we had the Finance in Common Summit, which gathered 450 development banks from around the world, from the Chinese ones to the European and African ones in particular, where you find the greatest number of development banks. And together they not only gathered for the first time, but they also committed to aligning their investment, which is 10% of global investment. That's a lot of money, about $2 trillion a year, behind the climate objectives, the SDGs in general, but the climate objectives. So, overall, my point is one thing that think tank can do is perhaps go beyond just focusing on great power relations, China, US. Of course, it's important. It's structuring the international system, but it's not all the international system. There are many other things happening in the international system, and more importantly, many things that we can do, that we can actually have impact on, and that can have an effect. I'll finish with just a word about the Biden administration. I would say, of course, it's going to be better. That is to say, yes, there is a shift in the distribution of power. I think Tim Summers was quite right in pointing that out. That makes for a different game. That makes for a different US attitude overall. It's not just about being a Democrat or a Republican, even though you could argue that Trump was not a traditional Republican. But still, it will make a difference because the lens through which the US will see the world and will act on the world will be different. Let me just take one example. Samantha Power is being rumored to, get a job with Tony Blinken at State Department. And the three things that she put forward recently were very meaningful, based on what I just say. One was she was calling for the US to lead the way in making vaccines available to the whole world. And so that is a very good sign indeed. And I hope the US rejoin the Act A initiative I just mentioned. And also reopening the doors to foreign students. And that's really important because along with think tanks, along with this fabric of the international system, universities and students are a sort of connective tissue, if you'd like, of societies that can dampen the competition among great powers and can do a lot of good. I'm sorry I've been a bit too long, but these were the points that I wanted to put forward. And I'm taking the advantage to say hi to Sri, Hongjian, and Wang Ping, and the many friends that I see here around the Zoom. I don't have time to mention them all.
Thank you very much, Justine. Very thorough and broad-ranging comments about some important topics that we've touched on today. Let me move on to our final speaker today, last but certainly not least, Jia Daoxiong, who is a professor and member of the academic committee of the Institute of International and Strategic Studies at Peking University. And he's also a CCG non-resident fellow. Professor Da, please.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to join you, although for different reasons. I'm in Beijing, but doing this online. Let me quickly go through some of the points I penciled down to answer your questions. My research institute works very closely with CCG, but of course, we are more teaching and research oriented. We look forward to joining the network CCG wisely set up with the assistance and the concurrence of so many others. In terms of the impact of COVID-19 on research, the downside is we have more report writing that's, well, based on less communication or direct observation. This is not just health driven, it's also policy driven. As you know, there have been restrictions for political reasons on meetings between diplomat officials and scholars. And it can be negative. I think the earlier point made by Justin, that this can self-affirm some of the biases or the positions, especially when you consider the different connotations used in language. But hopefully the situation of us speaking just by online is not going to last that long. Then nothing can be worse when you have graduates who purely write based on words and then join the leagues of diplomacy, and then they have to speak on behalf of government, and they speak on issues where they don't really have much of a feel in first place. That's very terrible. But then with regard to the incoming US administration, I think we need to bear in mind that this really is the start of another cycle of the permanent election in US politics. And Congress will continue to be Congress. The Congress waits to be lobbied. It acts in an all-in-one fashion when it comes to human rights, when it comes to trade, any other issue. It's an all-in-one. It's the accuser, it's the judge, and it's the enforcer. So if you look at the activism in terms of China legislations, mostly punitive of Congress, you were a diplomat here in Beijing, you are literally dealing with hundreds after hundreds of secretaries of Treasury, Defense, or states in Washington, D.C. It's not going to change. And I'm not just trying to be purposely negative. This is just the structure of polity we have in Washington, D.C. In terms of what I would propose for think tank network to do down the road, let me come up with a full item list. The network should really take on this notion of China as a challenger. Is this based on assessment of intent or projection of intent? Or is this based on more on analytical rigor? And I spoke about this earlier at another webinar where Hongjian attended. What is China? What constitutes Chinese speak? Who speaks for China? How do you make sense of certain words and certain policies? So I hope the network can lead to more collaborative work in terms of that will help in terms of substance and in terms of appeal to its readers, both here in China and abroad. The second topic, I hope this is a not so low a common denominator, is climate change. China has pledged to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. This should not be turned into another source of skepticism. To the extent I know, this is based on announcement, it's based on professional assessment. In the 14th five-year plan, we will start to have specific policies in the industries that lead to a peak of emissions by 2030 or even earlier. And this will require actions on the part of China. It will also require a globally enabling policy environment. For you to actually reduce emissions, you will have to deploy technologies, 5G, for example. And many of the technologies are considered to be either dual use or prestige or competition. What do you want, right? How do you balance all this? So we as a think tank should take these kind of topics head on without failing ourselves as a collective of humanity. Now, a third topic is supply chains. It's very understandable for the kind of thinking to move on from a just-in-time type of global logic, the logic of global supply chains, to just-in-case. That's very sensible. But then, how far do this policy-induced change does this go? Do we have to factor in so many other issues? What really is at stake? In terms of the how do we come up with a matrix of looking at the issues that involved in this kind of change that's going to be in place, and how do we speak to the business community and to the consumers as well as workers that are going to be part of the change in supply chains. Now, a fourth topic I would really want, this is very much echoing what was said before about international cooperation to develop and distribute vaccines. Let's face it, most of the participants in this network represent the better off societies. If we are serious about international collaboration in vaccine production, distribution, and deployment, we should really work on localized production, distributions. For example, in Southeast Asia, what do we do with Indonesia, right, as a local regional distribution center? Or are we saying that the kind of cooperation we envision is something that follows the good old Jones Act in the United States, saying everything whole supply chain has to originate from one country, and that does not seem to me to be well that serves the purpose. In other words, for this think tank collaboration to move forward, we have to have a seriously globally inclusive approach to it. That's an academic person speaking, and it's maybe a little further away from the actual world of business and political operations, but I hope I did not waste too much of your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daljung. Certainly did not waste our time, and I think that one of the interesting characteristics of a think tank is that it does have to strike that balance between academia, research, knowledge creation, and the practical realities of the marketplace, operational efficiencies, these types of very much business issues. So thank you for that very thorough and far-ranging sharing with us. I think that echoes what other people have said and provided us with tremendous breadth of this discussion today. I'd like to hone in on one thing you said about Biden Congress. So there's certainly perhaps even a celebratory mood with the Biden administration that seems to be increasing as more and more appointments are made. And you raised the point that perhaps we should not be overly optimistic because of structural features in the US political system. I'd like to go back to Paolo then and ask, Paolo, what are your thoughts about the incoming administration, and in particular, how is your think tank, and how should think tanks in general position themselves, or what should they focus on with the incoming Biden administration?
Thank you, Andy. I think that with Biden is, as many others said, easy to improve, but at the same time is easy to indulge in wishful thinking and excess of optimism. Take Europe. Trump was the storm, the perfect storm. Biden is seen as the calm after the storm. Let's say that with Biden, and again I'm echoing what others said, with Biden at the White House, we will most likely go back to a situation where the US leads from behind, which is a great improvement after 4 years of lack of leadership, or even more, obstacle to any kind of shared solution. The lead from behind will be pretty similar to where the Obama administration had left the world 4 years ago. And this means, as Justin said, that the prospect for some kind of international cooperation, not exactly the multilateral cooperation we had in mind, we have been experiencing before, these prospects are better than with Trump, but at the same time, not to exceed in optimism and risk disillusion, we should not count too much on the power and will of the president-elect. For think tanks may be in a prime position to take advantage of the opening of the incoming US president. For example, at the G20 level, which need to do more, to act more, and to produce more. This will happen if we, think tanks, are capable to provide policy recommendation which may be heard also by government, also by the US. This is a crucial issue for think tanks. The G20 very often is made, unfortunately, by words and not action, and think tanks are part of this problem. We are very good in words and not very good in providing sound and practical policy recommendation. So it's a better scenario, but that doesn't mean it will be easy, and it doesn't mean that think tanks can play a relevant role if we do not make our homework correctly.
Great, thank you very much, Paolo. Yongfu, I believe you also wanted to add something about the Biden administration, and in particular, the bilateral investment treaties with Europe and with the United States.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me another chance. And I believe that Biden actually, even before he could be in the office of the White House, he already announced his policy or strategy to renew the relationship with his allies. So I think TTIP will be a kind of negotiation, could be again pick up by Biden administration. At the same time, and the interaction between the United States and Europeans as allies, they could be more intensive. So that's provide a kind of opportunities for China to play a quite important role in terms of the multilateral cooperation, because we talk about environment, for example, Paris Agreement. But at the same time, China is going to face another kind of challenge, because I talked about the BIT, which has a mandate to have it finalized between China and EU before the end of this month. If we cannot accomplish that goal, and the future could be more complicated because they have very good, perhaps much more intensive dialogue between those allies, United States and EU. So I think the argument or the challenges which is facing by China could be even difficult to be solved. So I think it's quite complicated issue for China, and if they can join hands and asking much more, for China and to be faced. So I think that's a challenge. Well, to simply answer your question, and I think the good things for the multilateral issues, and we have a lot of opportunities to cooperate, triangulate EU, United States, and China. But for some bilateral issues, and if they can go hand in hand, China is going to have more complicated situation.
Great, thank you very much, Hongfu. So I'd like to go to Tim for a minute. Tim, you talked about one of the challenges facing the world today is a distribution or a redistribution of power. And I believe you're referring largely to material power, whether that's economic or military. I wonder if you have any thoughts on conceptual power, because one way we can interpret the differing outcomes in response to the COVID pandemic is difference in political ideology, governance model, and perhaps more operational issues around governments. And I wonder if you'd have any thoughts you'd like to share. This seems like a very classic think tank kind of question.
Thanks, Andy. I'm not quite sure what a classic think tank kind of answer is to that sort of question, but I mean, you're right to say that I was referring primarily to material redistribution of power in economic terms, to some extent military terms as well. But I think you're also right to highlight the way that the sort of ideational debate, the debates about ideas and ideologies and governance models and systems has come to the fore over the course of 2020. And I think what we haven't seen, right, is any sort of spread of any one governance model or ideology beyond the particular confines of states where that model may already be reasonably popular. I mean, my perception is in China, for example, that the Chinese model has been reasonably resilient through COVID-19 and that there's a sort of positive outcome there. But I don't think that outcome or that perception is shared, for example, in Europe. And some of my European friends may contradict me on this, and they're very welcome to. But looking at the UK, for example, I think perceptions of China have worsened as a result of COVID. Now, whether that's rational or reasonable, we can debate, but I think that's the political reality. And again, I mean, back to the politics here, the politics, I think, is not bringing us together. It's pushing us further apart at the moment. It's difficult to come up with those ideas that will help bridge the gap.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. Maybe we have time for a question or two from the audience, if there are any. And then after that, I would like to ask each of our distinguished panelists to wrap up with a 1-minute summary, and perhaps they want to share some predictions of where they see the world going. So let me see, are there any questions from the audience? Going once, going twice. Last chance. Any questions?
No questions. No questions.
No.
Too late in the afternoon. Oh, there's one.
No questions.
There's one. The lady in the back.
Oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Xiangdi, and I'm a former intern in Congress as an international student from China. So in short, I had a very interesting perspective of American politics in 2019. And it's sad to say, sometimes when I was sitting in the briefing rooms in Congress and they were talking about international students being engaging in questionable activities. So I guess my question is, as somebody who had a passion for diplomacy and was on track to pursue a career in that, but yet now, after seeing COVID and this just a global transition, has reconsidered this decision. So as experts in geopolitics and I imagine diplomacy, what would you say to somebody like me, or because I'm only a representation of what's happening to thousands of students around the world. So I really appreciate to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Maybe Mike, if you have a question, you want to ask yours too, and then who would you like to answer that question, if anyone in particular? Okay.
Hello, everyone. Very nice to meet you guys again, the distinguished panelists. My question is that we know that the EU-China bilateral trade agreement will achieve, many scholars looking forward to that. But when we achieve and what impact will have for our EU-China relation, and what kind of impact for the whole geopolitical picture, what kind of impact it will have? Thank you.
Sorry. Yes. Thank you for this question. Firstly, according to my understanding, that very, very possible that both two sides, China and the EU, will finish the negotiation in the end of this year for this CAI for European side, BIT for Chinese side. And I think it will give more confidence for both two sides to continue this cooperation, not only investment, market access, and also it will open the window for this forthcoming FTA negotiation between two sides. So it's a very, very, I think, a positive message issued by China and the EU, not only to each other and also to the world economy. And hopefully that it will be combined with some possible change brought by Mr. Biden. Because also we know that in the past 4 years, it looks like the major logic for the international politics and international relations, especially between major powers, is more suspicions with each other, and the more separations, decouplings, and more conflicts. Hopefully, this year, especially the very, very big impact of COVID-19 and the lesson the human being learned from this disaster, we can try to change the logic in the past 4 years. We can try to find a new approach to get along with each other, especially for the major players, China, EU, and the United States. So hopefully, I agree with Mr. Sen, my neighbor, some evolution about how about this China, EU, US relation. But I do have a little different views on this possible situation for EU and the US trade and investment negotiation. As we know, the TTIP launched by the Obama during the Obama period. I think there will be a high target, especially from European Union side, that we will start the TTIP negotiation. But I think it's very difficult because it's very, very different. The current situation in American society and also in European society. So maybe there will be a middle target for both two sides is to have a new negotiation, but not so comprehensive, not so ambitious, a kind of a selected negotiation. But anyway, I think that so far, the most important thing brought by Mr. Biden is maybe comparing with Trump administration, there will be more certainties. I think that would be I mean, exciting message, not only for EU and also for China. Another, I think, very positive message from possible Mr. Biden's administration is there will be maybe the chance or maybe opportunities for more negotiation. Before we talk about the cooperation, we should focus on negotiation, which means that Mr. Biden and maybe the new American administration could provide some more, chances for other players to influence United States, or we can try to find out a mutual influence model for China, EU, and the US. So finally, I think that there will be good news, just like a lady mentioned that I believe that there will be end of the negotiation of the BIT between China and EU. And then once there are some more positive, attitude or actions by United States, possibly, I think the next year, 2021, maybe we try to, face a very different period or very different, situation than this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe that Dao Zhong has a question. Professor Jia.
I was going to say that these trade agreements or investment agreements, especially in the case of China, and the essential part we often don't talk about is how to get the companies to familiarize themselves with the negotiated rules and practice them without the companies taking advantage of them or complying with the agreed rules. Frictions are bound to come back. So that's a very important point of homework. We sometimes are too shy to talk about, especially in relation to China. And it's something I hope work like Adenauer Foundation and other think tanks can illustrate how that's done in their countries, because Germany has been very active in negotiating these and making use of them. Now, I also wanted to say something to the student who asked about what is in this for them who aspire to do good in international affairs. There are probably 2 points of advice. One is that you act out of good faith, and governments do all sorts of things, including spying on each other. You want to make a decision about your personal mission in life. Do you want to be part of that? Or if you do, then, well, you're free to do it, but then you also face some of the consequences. It's not very useful just to say there are, those suspicions out there. And secondly, for students, it's very, very, very important to have a sense of history, to read, and history does not automatically repeat itself, but history can offer you lessons for predictable patterns of behavior. After all, politics, the dynamics does not change that much. That's probably what I was going to. Okay, one last point, since you gave me the opportunity. What Tim said about ideational competition, especially out of the COVID situation. What I have observed is that think tanks around the world, probably very few of them have done this, but it needs to be done. It's to critically analyze where and why this absence of empathy towards the actual victims, actual sufferers of the virus. When people talk about, outside China, talk about COVID here in China, they invariably refer to the system. And you learn from anybody but not China. But when people talk about it here in China, as noted, there's sometimes a lot of jubilance and saying this was a reaffirmation of some aspects of the system. And they talk about a Chinese model. Either it's in relation to COVID or in relation to other things, is wrong-headed. It fits right into the Cold War framework of saying, you want to be the locomotive of a group of society or the countries whereby everyone else either choose to follow or miss the train. That's a very disastrous way of framing the issues. I can go on and on. You don't really want the professor to keep talking. It's getting late. Thank you very much.
Very much, Dao Jung. So let me maybe wrap it up here since we are at our time limit. And just briefly summarize the panel discussion. So of course we're in very challenging times, but I think as our panelists have pointed out that in fact this is an opportunity to rebuild the global order, and these challenges brought on by COVID-19 have forced think tanks to be more multidisciplinary, even more multidisciplinary than they already were, including public health, technology, other disciplines. And as a result, in fact, there is an even greater need for ideas, for rigorous analysis, for sound policy recommendations as we move forward in a world where we are facing perhaps future public health crises, climate change, political disruptions, that in fact think tanks are more important than ever, and we should all continue working together in a people-to-people way, whether that's face-to-face where we can, or online, as we've seen today with the 2.2 million viewers, the ability to bring people together from all around the world that otherwise would not have been able to meet, to share ideas and gain deeper insights. So thank you all for your time, for your wisdom, for your experience. I'm going to end the panel here and turn it over to Henry Wang, our president.
Okay, I think I'll just say a few words. And first of all, I want to thank our distinguished panelists very much for coming today. And we had a very productive day. And then James McGann and myself, we opened the forum this morning. The CCG and the TTCSP, we actually have this joint annual. This is the 5th annual Global Think Tank Innovation Forum. And also this forum was also supported by Development Institute of South China University of Economic Finance, but also with Kobo Foundation and also UPenn Wharton Center here in Beijing. So it's really a great event. We had quite a few topics. We had a very exciting morning section about the U.S.-China relations. We had heritage and bookings and Cato's and Atlantic Council, and also think tank from China as well. We have also keynote. We have a social think tanks discussion, private think tank discussion this afternoon. We had now the China European think tanks, and also morning we had a very big think tanks among all the major Chinese think tanks in the conference as well. So actually, as Andy said, we had this afternoon. I was just watching the numbers. It's actually almost reached 1 million viewers for our panel this afternoon, and so the whole day we had about 2.6 million viewers on the social media and online live coverage. So I want to say that think tank community is still built very strong, and appreciate all of you coming here. And I know Justin Vassin just finished a big Paris Peace Forum, and with the 50 heads of state, everyone was there. And I know also ISPI is very active from European think tank, and also we are actually going to have another event with Bruegel in Brussels next week with Dr. Wolf. I'm going to have a dialogue with him sometime in December, and also Chatham House as well. So, but our Chinese colleagues, from Huang Ping and from Mr. Trey and Mr. Sun and Mr. Zhang, all experts on think tanks and on European affairs. We hope that we can conclude the comprehensive investment treaty with EU, and we hope that we can also engage CPTPP with US, and we hope that we have another exciting annual forum, China Think Tank, for next year, and we hope we invite you in person. So I think on behalf of organizer, on behalf of Dr. McGann, we're going to conclude. I want to thank our over 100, actually throughout the day, about 200 to 300 people come, but still we have 100 people in the room, and we want to thank all of you very much, particularly our panel, our expert from also CCG and Adenauer Foundation and our staff as well. So once again, we have to conclude. I know many of you still have a lot to say, but